If you look at the really great next generation companies, they're really what I call first principles companies. So it's just being really good at what you do and be comfortable with that, be sanguine about that, and don't fall prey to cycles and fads and other things.
Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure.
I will live every day as if there were a microphone tucked under my tongue.
It's great to get in the game, but don't get in the game till you understand the rules till you're an insider.
Your life changes when you begin having a different conversation in your head.
What we need to do in radically deep problems is propose radically visionary solutions.
Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Julie Masters, and you are listening to another episode of Inside Influence, in which I delve into the minds of some of the world's most fascinating influencers or experts in influence to get to the bottom of what it really takes to own your voice and then amplify it to drive an industry, a conversation, a movement, or a nation. Now, here's today's question. What does it take to face your critics? And I mean squarely, unflinchingly, with full self-responsibility. However, and this part is all important, still willing to defend yourself when it counts. Now, responsibility, it's a really interesting word to me. You know, I've always understood it to mean the ability to respond. Taking full ownership of the fact that while you might not be able to control what happens, you are always able to control what you do next. Now, as a place to begin, I think that's a pretty good one. However, what we don't often talk about is those moments where the stakes are high, the information is ever-changing, and there are only bad options on the table. Now that, as my next guest would say, is leadership in the hot seat. Now imagine you're new to the reins of one of the world's most respected brands. You've woken up to a global tragedy of unprecedented scale that has imploded a huge proportion of your revenue, an out-of-control 24-hour news cycle, all eyes on you, and the legacy of this company now resting in your hands. Jeff Immelt was the 9th chairman of GE and served as CEO for 16 years. He's been named one of the world's best CEOs 3 times by Barron's. During his tenure as CEO, GE was also named America's most admired company by Fortune magazine and one of the world's most respected companies in polls by Barron's and the Financial Times. He has received no less than 15 honorary degrees, numerous awards from business leadership, and chaired the President's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness under the Obama administration. He is now also the author of Hotseat, which, as he would describe, is a memoir of leadership in times of crisis. Now, when I first opened that book, one of the first lines grabbed my attention immediately. And that was this. He said, "My legacy as the CEO of GE was, at best, controversial." Now, if you take any time to dive into the press coverage of Jeff's tenure as CEO of GE, having taken over the reins from Jack Welch back in 2001, along with all those accolades, you might also read words like tumultuous, misguided, or a disaster. Yet, what you might not read is that during those 16 years, GE also generated more earnings and cash flow than the previous 110 years combined. So how do you tell that story? Do you tell that story? Do you set the media record straight, reinsert some much-needed context in between the sound bites? Or do you just let the narrative quietly die out and then go on to teach some of those invaluable lessons you learnt on the hot seat to the next generation of leaders? Jeff's answer? You do both. In this conversation, we dived right into the heartbreak of those moments where everything comes crashing down, and the hard leadership choices that inevitably come next. Why choosing who you listen to is always the single most important decision you will ever make in life, in love, and in leadership. The 3 voices that every leader must master in order to effectively drive change. We get into what those voices are and why they are so important to steering yourself and your team forward. Why the role of any leader during and after a crisis is to learn how to absorb the fear of their teams. And what I loved about this is that it begins with not tools and tactics, but having the people and the places available to you as a leader to absorb your own fear. And finally, why it is so much easier to talk about our successes than our failures, especially if there was no great hero's triumph at the end, and the damaging impact that our failure to talk about those moments has on those leaders who come next. For me, I genuinely feel like we're entering a new chapter now, and I'm hoping it's short-lived, where it feels like some of the best and the most brilliant minds are now choosing not to lead in our organizations, our communities, and particularly in our politics. Because let's face it, who would want that? What sane human being dreams of opening themselves and all too often their loved ones up to the scrutiny of 24 hours of analysis, criticisms, memes, and cancellations? But here's the problem with that. What it leaves us with is leaders who thrive on drama, outrage, and ongoing conflict, or those who are just completely immune to the impact of their actions on other people. Now, I know that's a depressing thought, or at least it is for me. But like Jeff, there is something else that we can choose to do. We can start having and supporting different conversations about leadership, ones that celebrate failure as much as success, ones that focus on context as much as easy to digest content, ones that celebrate the legacy of a leader as more than just the sum of their wins and their losses, but how they faced up to the challenges that they were given. That seat, that might not be quite as scalding hot, but I'm willing to bet more incredible people would be willing to sit on it. Now, for those of you who are ready to take your journey in leadership or your journey in influence to the next level, don't forget, hop on my website or the show notes. I think it's also in the social media comments, and download the latest version of my ebook, The Influencer Code. It covers the 7 areas and the 7 core questions that I have found hands down to be the most useful when it comes to fast tracking your level of influence. Just pop in your email address. It'll be in your inbox in the time it takes to pour yourself a cup of tea. On that note, sit back, drive safe, cycle on, sharpen your pencils, and please, please soak up the iconic wisdom of the incredible Jeff Immelt. Welcome to the podcast, Jeff Immelt.
Thanks, Julie. Good to be here.
I'm going to start by asking the usual question that I ask at the beginning of this podcast, which is, what is there one idea at the moment that's having a significant impact on your thinking or the way that you perceive the world? And it could be a new idea, or it could be a timeless idea.
Yeah. So it's both new and old, but I would say it's the subject of class. And most people look at the U.S. as Republican and Democrat, but most things that divide us today are really class. And by that I mean I live on both coasts, both East Coast and West Coast, and I teach a class at Stanford. And I was going from East Coast to West Coast, and I stopped in Wichita, Kansas, which is the aviation capital of the U.S. And there are 2 companies there run by ex-GE guys. And I spent a day touring 2 factories in the Midwest. And then I flew out to Stanford, to California, where I do my venture work and teach at Stanford. And what I realized is that my students at Stanford, in their aspiration career, are never going to intersect with the people I saw in Wichita working in the aviation sector, right? And it just was, and I don't say that judgmentally. I say that as just, they want to do venture, they want to do tech, they want to do consulting, but they don't want to do kind of hardcore manufacturing, engineering. And so I think a lot today about how in the next generation we're going to bring together different industries, different regions, because, people can talk about Trump and people can talk about Republicans and Democrats and all that stuff, but what really is dividing us is just class, basic Charles Dickens kinds of things are what's really dividing. And I don't think that's unique to the US necessarily. I think this is really something that's going on. So that's maybe it's old, maybe it's new, but that's something, as I've taught and as I do my work, something I've thought about. In my career, I worked with maybe 1 million people who were different than I was, right? But my students are all entering their career, all working with people that are just like they are, right? And I don't know if that's good or bad. I love my students, but it's different. It's causing me to think.
And I think that there's a significant question there as well from a leadership standpoint, right? Like how we teach leadership or how we move people through the pathway of leadership. And a part of that is the ability to bring on diversity of opinions, the ability of being able to bring all people to the table and understand all experiences in order to be able to make a genuine decision with the best interests of all at mind. I interviewed Bob Chapman, who's the CEO of Barry Waymiller, a few months ago now, and he called it the concept of stewardship, of the leader as steward, and being a steward of your organization means that you need to have conversations with at every level of that organization. But I don't know that we teach people how to do that at the moment.
I think it's not only inside our organizations, right? So I always, my dad was kind of a frontline manager at GE, so I always knew how to converse with really everybody at GE because I lived with everybody at GE. I grew up with everybody, and I could see the company through their eyes, but also on macro ideas. I'll give you something that's near and dear, I'm sure, to your heart as an Australian, which is climate. Like I believe that climate change is existential, but I would really like to drive change, right? But I was watching a panel from Davos last week, right? And somebody's on a panel and they're saying, well, the only maybe good news of the Ukrainian war is it's made energy prices higher. So that's going to force us to drive the change to green energy sooner. And I want to say, like bullshit on you, really. If you think $7 gas to a middle-class American is going to drive clean technology faster, you arrogant SOB, it's just like, what is wrong with you? So the language bridge and the notion of seeing, and that's why we're not making more progress on things like climate change, is because everybody at the top, all the elites can see something some way, but it's not a tops-down initiative. It's a bottoms-up initiative. It's a state by state and power plant by power plant. And our language doesn't encompass those people that need to drive change. And so, one of the things I teach in my class, which is like leadership, is about convincing the people that don't agree with you, not the people that agree with you. That's actually easy, It's the people that don't agree with you that's the hard part. So anyhow, that's kind of so that's what's been on my mind is
it's interesting to me. A colleague of mine, he's a speaker who speaks all over the world. He's a futurist, talks about future trends, what's happening. And he's in, hundreds of organizations every year. And he just sent me his book, his latest book that's coming out soon to read. And it's a segue for him. He's talking about change. And what he's saying is that, I have spoken to all his organizations about the trends that are coming, like both top level and frontline staff. And he said, and I've seen, even though people agree that this is coming, I've seen the inability to change to meet it. And one of the things that he pinpoints in that is the language issue. We don't know how to use language well enough to make it accessible and attractive enough for people to get on board.
100% true. It's one of the things that I actually learned from Jack Welch that I try to teach my entrepreneurs. And I also talk about in class, like every leader needs 3 voices, right? You need a total company voice. Like in my case, it was a 300,000 person voice, right? And that's got a certain set of vocabulary. you need a 20-person voice, right? How do you run a meeting? And you need a one-on-one voice. You're fired. Okay. Like you're doing great. You're fired. Do this better. Do less of this. Do that. And each one is a different vocabulary. Each one is a different set of verbs. Each one is a different aspiration, and he was really good at it. I tried to be good at it. I've seen leaders fail at it. Sometimes entrepreneurs are really good at, here's the total company in the scheme, but you put them one-on-one with somebody and they like, I can't do it, Jeff. You don't understand. Like,
Yeah, I've met many of those leaders where you put them on a stage in front of 1,000 people and they will rock the room. Everyone will come out just going, "Where do I sign?" But you put them one on one with a human being that's actually responding in real time and can talk back in real time, and that's a different ball game, right? Like this, neither's wrong nor right. That's just a different ball game. Just as a recommendation, by the way, because I know that you're not busy. Your next book by the Three Voices of Leadership is an
yeah, there you
amazing
go.
title for
Maybe
a
you
book.
can maybe you can help me write. But Julie, so climate is something I've worked on since the early 2000s. I would say climate. The reason why climate is failing or is not doing as well as we would like, vocabulary is really in the center of it. We talk past each other. We don't understand that you need both a decarbonization message, but also an economic message. We just are terrible at it, and so I quite think that's a great it's a great concept for a book.
Well, I want to talk about Hotseat, which when I first saw the book, I thought I was attracted to both the book itself and also your story. And it wasn't until I got into the book that I realized how layered that was as a journey for you in terms of writing that book. And you start Hot Seat with the words, "My legacy as a CEO was at best controversial." Why was it important for you? It felt like it was important for you to start there.
I wanted to tell the story for two reasons. One is I knew that it was an extremely complicated story, that there were good things and bad things, and unless it was told transparently and completely and openly, it would appear to be defensive and a whitewash, and I didn't want that. I didn't need that, and I didn't want that, and it couldn't be that, right? And the second thing is, like, most business books really stink, and it really stinks because whoever's writing it is like, "Look at me, I'm a genius, everything was great, and I invented, I'm God, I invented everything, and everything was perfect." And I just got to tell you, that's like, it's a lonely job. It's an insecure job. All the shit comes to you every day. All the fun stuff happens elsewhere. All the crap comes to you. And today, like, I had it easy compared to what the CEOs deal with today. It's only gotten tougher as time goes on. So that's really why I wrote it. I hired a woman who I didn't know, but a woman who was an investigative reporter for Vanity Fair and the LA Times, and she was really brutal and really tough on me and others. She interviewed, more than 80 people of every kind, and so she, did her work. And so I think, Julie, the more complicated the story is, the more fulsome it has to be. It's kind of one of those things. And so I knew it was wading into, a really, let's say, complicated space. And so it was important to me that it be as complete as it could possibly be. And part of the defense mechanism of a human being's mind is that you remember the 90% of every story where you're good and not bad. And you need other people to tell you, well, that's not the way it really happened. There was these kind of crappy things that you did that I want you to remember as well. And so that's what the book really tried to do. I'm at peace with it. There were some good things. There were some not good things. I think, as a business person or just any leader in general, it's okay to be critical. if you want to lead, you're going to be criticized, and that's okay. I think it's also sometimes okay to be lied about, right? But if you're lied about and it actually hurts other people and not just you have a right to defend the context, right? If it's not just hurting you, and if you're lied about and it hurts other people, but it also makes people make bad decisions because of the lies, you probably should, get a more fulsome story out there, right? And that's really the background with which I wrote the book.
I heard you say in an interview, it was a while ago, you said truth equals facts plus context. And you had felt like the context of your tenure there had gone missing in the conversation, which it does, right? The current news cycles, the way that we treat information and news at the moment is, it is the opposite of context. Context requires space and time and investigation. And as you said, the fullness of a story to be held. You also said that you weren't sure that you could write it. So you felt like it needed to be written, but you weren't sure that you could write it. What changed your mind about writing the book?
Yeah, in some ways, it was heartbreaking. In other words, this was kind of a huge part of my life. I have a great wife and daughter, but in 2017, when it ended, I was just heartbroken. I was broken, really. And we had lived all over the place, but I wanted to do venture, and I convinced my wife to move to California. Uh, I needed space to heal, and in California, like nobody cares about anything but themselves, basically. So it's a
It is
good
is
place.
a beautiful narcissistic landscape.
Exactly. It's the best place to go. So I didn't want to hide, but I wanted to heal, right? I needed some space and time. And again, it was like I said, criticism is fair, and there were things I deserve to be criticized for. There was, and there were things that just weren't true. But I'm sitting around in probably 2018, and you could see like areas around the company where, based on the criticism, things were being done that actually weren't very smart, or were leading down a path that just wasn't good for the company or just the people that work there, right? And that's probably when I decided to write the book. That I basically said, look, not only is the context gone missing, but it's gone missing in a dangerous way. Good people are leaving, bad decisions are being made, the wrong people are winning, and there just needs to be a different narrative about this great company, right? And let people make the judgments they make. But this is, and for me, I gave all the money to my high school, so it wasn't about making money or anything like that. It was just about putting a more complete picture to what had been a big part of my life, but also what had been a big part of, kind of the American business scene for a long time, and with a lot of good leaders, a lot of good people, and products that mattered, a company that mattered.
I love that you used the term heartbreak there, because I think that it speaks to, especially at the moment, a lot of incredible businesses have, if not gone down over the last couple of years, have significantly, gone to their knees and are now trying to get back up again. And, I think that we can use a lot of jargon to talk about how that feels as a leader, as a person in the hot seat in those situations. But the truth of it, as far as I've ever encountered it, is that it's heartbreak. It's heartbreaking to watch those things happen. And it's heartbreaking to watch something that you have built, be either destroyed or talked about in a way that is not doesn't feel to you to be accurate. How did you move through that? We're going to go to the journey itself in a second, but in the year after you left, and you were there, you were CEO 16 years, and a lot happened in those 16 years. But how did you move through that in the kind of 12 months?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think you've got to keep going. In other words, I've talked to a lot of friends, and I'd say the first thing is you need, Julie, everybody has friends, and when you're CEO of GE, you have a lot of friends, right? But you need extraordinary friends, and you have
Not the
you,
friends that just tell you it's going to be fine. Just
exactly.
you'll be fine,
And
or
I
you'll be
think
right, as we say in Australia.
and like like maybe you go into a down cycle and you have 1,200 friends, but you find you have like 17 extraordinary friends.
If you're
And so I say
lucky, that's a good amount. I wouldn't say I have
And so
17.
I'd say first and foremost, you need extraordinary friends, and I had some extraordinary friends, both in the business world and personally, who stood by me, and that helps. And the second thing is you got to keep moving. You can't curl up in a ball, and you've got to keep making a contribution. You got to show up in public, even when you think you're going to be embarrassed or things like that, and you have to keep moving. You've got to find the ways that you can make a relevant contribution, whether that's to small companies or founders or startups or teaching. And then you've got to think small again, get out of the limelight, go brick by brick, rebuild a house, foundation, brick by brick by brick. And I sit here 5 years later. I did a speaking event in Canada over the weekend, and what you find is just like, you're now a different story. You're a turnaround, right? Or you're a survivor, or you're some kind of different story. And there's such a residual goodwill because they remember GE in 2006 or 2012 or 1992 or something like that, and they don't think about the last 5 years or other things. But the most important thing is you have to find it inside yourself, uh, to keep moving. I tell my students, and I've said this for many many years, which is, in your career, you basically answer three questions in your career. It's how fast you can learn, and you just have to learn every day. And I lived a life where I could get smarter every day. Some days I got smarter than others, right? But I could get smarter every day. How much you can give to others, right? Are you really good at picking people, coaching people, making people better, collecting people, connecting, that kind of thing? And then how much shit can you take? Like, can you take a punch? Can you persevere? Can you I say to my students, like, I can't even tell you how many nights I went to bed a complete failure, right? And just felt like I was just devastated with my own incompetence. And I would wake up the next morning and I look in the mirror and I would say, "You're the best person in the world. I can't believe how good you are." And you just have to be able to renew yourself, and you have to have this perpetual learning, renewal, perseverance. And typically people give up before their capability limits them. And those are the three questions you have to answer.
And there's a theme that runs through your book. It's actually the title of the first chapter, which is showing up. And I think that, my career in leadership doesn't even hold a candle to yours. However, one thing in those moments where you go to bed and you think, I am ridiculously inept for this. Like, how on earth am I here? Those moments, the thing that would get me up again the next morning and back on that horse again the next morning would be the knowledge that, okay, I don't always know what I'm doing. I don't always have the right answers. I don't even always have the right questions. But I know that I will show up. I know that I will show up. And that if I can do that, with the best of intentions, then the rest hopefully will follow. But
100%.
the commitment to showing up.
100%. Even if you just show up and say, I don't have the answers today, but I'm here. And together we're gonna go down a path, we're gonna figure it out. And I think the other thing I talk about, Julie, is just absorbing fear. Another word I always have a hard time with. Not that I don't agree with it, but I don't know exactly what it means is transparency. I remember I was in Perth during the Fukushima nuclear disaster, and they were all like GE reactors, right, in Fukushima. So I was doing an all-employee meeting with 1,000 oil and gas executives, and so I'd been up all night doing a crisis call, and I'm watching CNN, and the scroll on and so there's a helicopter above Fukushima, and the scroll is, all GE reactors, GE's in trouble, probably going to have to evacuate Tokyo, maybe even Los Angeles, blah, 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 blah. Had to end that call to go do an all-employee meeting, right? So would transparency have been to walk into the all-employee meeting and say, hey, you know what, team? We are really screwed. We're in deep trouble. This is really horrible.
I haven't slept.
I haven't slept. You should have seen CNN. I know
if anyone has any ideas, come to the front.
But you may want to resign because, man, I don't know. Or is it to say, a lot of you have been following what's going on. We've got our best people working on it. Here's the way to think about it. But let's talk about your business, which is working in oil and gas and things like that. So it's I kind of like, I always talk about like transparency in the context of let's talk about the way things are and also the way things could be if they were really well run. Like, in other words, let's treat transparency as a complete thought and not just blurting out, treat it as.
You had this. Sorry.
Yeah, but here's the way things are. Like, as you guys can all see, there's a nuclear disaster in Fukushima, but there's an incredibly technically strong team that's looking at it. The reactor was built in 1967. Our general counsel has gone through the contract that was written at that time. It's incredibly well structured. We're going to give TEPCO whatever resources we can. There's a lot still to be known, blah, 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 blah. Complete the thought versus just blurting out, just to. A lot of people think transparency is taking my burden and giving it to Julie. That's transparency, right?
Yeah. And it's funny you have an issue with the word transparency, and I've mentioned it on this podcast before. I have an issue with the word authentic.
Yeah.
Because I feel like the same thing. I don't want you as a leader, nor do I want as a leader to show up 100% authentically, because 100% authentically could literally be, as we said, I am about to, I feel like I'm going to vomit and, I have no idea what we're doing next. And, plenty of leaders have been in that situation many, many, many times. And you said in the book while we're talking, to complete that thought, the opposite of that is to show up intentionally, which is, here are the facts as we know them. And then, my intention is to discuss this, is to move us forward.
Yeah.
So you're sharing where, what's happening, but you're also showing up with an intention as opposed to just a burden swap, as you described it.
It's exactly the burden swapping and is what I've always, it's again, sometimes in my business school class, I unteach things that they've been taught, like burden swapping is a good thing, or that you have to listen to everybody. That's the other one that I try to teach them. I say, listen, when I introduced a green initiative, clean tech initiative in GE in 2006, right? And I had 30 top executives in the room, and the vote was 28-2 against doing it. And we did it anyhow, right? Because everybody's, people said, this is stupid. Uh, we're not in business to do this stupid shit, right? Blah, 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 blah. And I said, hey guys, just get in line or leave. This is time that we drive this. And by the way, we can make money doing it, right? This is not a feel good. And it worked spectacularly well, right? I also got in trouble when I didn't, Ruth Perot at Morgan Stanley told me to sell commercial real estate before the financial crisis. I didn't listen. I got in trouble. So I listen. I've been on both sides of the trade. I've done great by not listening. I've gotten in trouble by not listening, but I've listened a lot. So here's what I've learned. There's like 5 people I listen to all the time that are around me, and I never contradict these 5 people because I trust them because they always put the company first, right? They have a true heart. They always put the company first. And there's a bunch of people I hear them, but I because they're selfish and they don't work that hard and they don't, they're good at what they do, but they're not true hearts, right? And companies are filled with all kinds of people. And I'm not a person with a big vocabulary, but I learned the meaning of the word cacophony, right? Because that's what companies are like when you're trying to make a decision. It's like all these symbols going off around you, and it's hard to make a melody, and that's the bottom line.
And actually, that was a lesson that I learned the hard way when I first started in my leadership journey in my early 20s, which was I thought that the best approach to leadership was to, bring a problem to a table and, what should we do? Listen to all opinions and then try and find a way to make everybody right, or try and find a way to make and actually a very smart person gave me the piece of advice that they don't want you to turn up with no solution. They want you to turn up with a solution and then debate the solution that you have come up with.
1,000%. You shouldn't be hosting the podcast. Somebody should be hosting you. You've got more of the better
Well,
interviewing. Come on, Julie.
You know what? That brings me to another quote from your book, actually, which I very much related to, because I was not a brilliant leader. And I had my moments, I had my great moments, and I had my shocking moments. But you said this beautiful thing. You said, as a CEO, I've been about as brilliant as I was lucky, by which I mean too often I was neither. And that really resonated with me because, as a leader, as a CEO, you have your moments of brilliance, right? There's a reason you're there. And you have your moments of brilliance. They're few. Sometimes if you're lucky, there's many. Sometimes they're few and far between, depending on the situation. And you have your moments where you just got lucky, where you listened to the right person at the right time. But it got me thinking, and if we can't rely on our brilliance to show up every day, and if we can't rely on our luck to show up every day, what are the traits or the mindsets or the behaviors that we can rely upon as leaders to show up every day?
I've come out here as in my second life and really become a student again. Julie, really become a student again of good companies. I read a lot, I watch a lot, and it's given me a chance to think. And I have to say, like, the company I've really fallen in love with, not me uniquely, but it is Apple, right? And so what's made Apple great? What's made Apple great, it's what I call a first principles company. And that is, in the beginning, they set out to make really great products foundationally. They delight their customers foundationally, right? They drive real efficiency, like foundationally. And you don't read about them, like lean manufacturing and Six Sigma and the last bullshit management idea, blah, blah, blah. They're just innovative product. You know what? They're not happy with the way Intel and Qualcomm make semiconductors. They do it themselves, and it's just, so that's what I call a first principles company. That's actually what Elon did at Tesla. It's actually what Gates did at Micro. So if you look at the really great next generation companies, they're really what I call first principles companies. So I think if I was advising, what is it that you can take to the bank today? It's just being really good. Just be really good at what you do and be comfortable with that. Be sanguine about that. And good days and bad, and don't fall prey to cycles and fads and other things. And it's just they don't manage the stock price. They don't watch Jim Cramer on CNBC. They don't do any of those things. And again, it's easy to say, hard to do, but really, I think that's really what I would say. They're just really about the essence of business. Their bureaucracy is very sparse, and they're really dedicated to the principles of technology and what they do.
I love the notion of first principles.
Yeah.
Like what are your first principles? And those are the things you can continually come back to, when luck and brilliance and sometimes even courage fall short.
Yeah. Yeah.
What are the things you can come back
Look, if
to?
you're running Boeing, your first principle is you got to make great planes. If you're running, I have 12 CEOs come through my class every year, right? And one was Delta's kind of the best run American airline, right? He has first principles in terms of how he runs the airline, and it makes a huge difference. And you can see that compared to United or Southwest or the other airlines. So, yeah.
I wanted to go back in time just for a little while, which was the first week into your tenure as CEO. And what happened during that week, which was 9/11. And when I was reading that kind of chapter of your book, and I know it spanned a few different places, you said that GE was connected to nearly every part of that tragedy. Now, I was really surprised by that. I wouldn't have put those two things together. Can you give me examples of the different impacts? So you're 1 week into the job here. Give me some examples as to what happened during that week.
Yeah, so 9/11, the tragedy happened. So at the board meeting on Friday, I was elected CEO and chairman. On Monday, I did an all-employee meeting to kind of introduce myself. I flew to Seattle Monday night, and then Tuesday morning, 9/11 happened. And so we own 1,200 aircraft at GE Capital. We had about 50% market share of the aviation sector of aircraft engines.
50%.
50%. We insured a big chunk of the World Trade Center through our insurance business. We owned NBC, right? So we owned the biggest network in the US. And so we televised without commercials for a week. We had a big write-off on the insurance of the World Trade Center. We had to worry about all the US airlines going into bankruptcy. We had to worry about, would people ever fly again? Really, all kinds of things. So, I mean, it was just like a whirlwind of disaster, right? In addition to 2 of our employees died. We worried about kind of the safety of our buildings and things like that. There's all kinds of concerns, let's say, that you wouldn't even have thought about beforehand about, physical safety and would there be other attacks and things like that. So, yeah, no, it was just kind of like crisis management, 101 from like day one.
I mean, it really was day one. And when I was reading through all the implications, it also struck me how many implications hit the business during that, essentially the first 48 hours of your tenure that I wouldn't have even thought of. And there was one where you were told you needed to buy $1 billion of American airline I'm going to say this right, EETC.
EETC. So it was, Julie, so we had we had all these like exposure to the airlines because we leased them aircraft. And so every night we would have kind of like these deal reviews to go through, because if the airlines went into bankruptcy, then we would take big write-offs on the airplanes and things like that. So, one night it would be, American needs $1 billion. We needed to buy some of their bonds, which are called WTCs, and we had 48 hours to make a decision, right? So
Otherwise, they were going to go bust.
they were going to go bust. They needed $1 billion of cash, and we had maybe a dozen people in the room, and I'm there, and I said, the only problem is I don't know what a WTC is, right? So there was a vice chairman who was a guy named Dennis Stearman, who I really loved. But the guy who ran G Capital, like I was slowing everything down and he was getting kind of irritable and pissed off. But Dennis, God love him, he would stop and say, okay, we're going to explain this to Jeff, even if it takes another hour. And so Dennis would go up on the board and say, okay, here's what the capital structure looks like, things like that. And then Dennis was really a gruff, he was just a grumpy, gruff, but really super shrewd and smart. And so the other thing that happened, Julie, was because nobody knew that a plane could be used as a missile, right, until 9/11. All the countries in the world had to pass a liability waiver so that we couldn't get sued if there were new terrorists. And so we grounded airplanes until all the countries passed this liability regime.
So airplanes around the world were all grounded until this particular liability.
Australia was one of the last ones, and so every night we would have to call like the president of the airline or even like the minister of aviation or something like that and say, look, you have 14 our business is called GCAS airplanes. You can't fly them tomorrow until you pass this liability regime, right? And so we divvied up the calls. And so Dennis would call, and he would call like the president of Poland, right? And he said, okay, you have 14 aircraft, you can't fly them tomorrow. And you could hear the guy screaming on the other line, blah, 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 and they'll say, hey, you can't fly the planes. And the guy would be screaming, Dennis would say, hey, fuck you, you can't fly the planes, shut up, blah, 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 hang up. And then the next one was me. I needed to call like the president of Qantas or something like that. But I said, Dennis, you're so good at that. Why don't you do the next call? So you take my call as well. You've got a special skill. You've got a special skill here.
Special sledgehammer skill going on there.
So that's like 4 days into the job. I'm calling prime ministers of countries, saying that your plane's grounded until you pass an insurance regime that says we won't get sued in case terrorists are in your country ready to fly aircraft into buildings.
How do you, again, I remember reading in the book that there was a moment during all of that where you called Gigi Michelson from the GE board of directors. And during that kind of first initial week, and again, it's worth saying again, you've only been in the job for a couple of days. And you said, I feel like I want to vomit all of the time.
Yeah.
How have you, or how did you learn how to deal with your own fear?
It got better over time, but at that moment, I just felt like there were days during that period that I just felt like I couldn't do it. There was just so much, but I kept showing up. I kept a straight face, but I said, Gigi, I need help. I need to know that you guys are with me. And do you have any advice? Can I be doing anything better? And Gigi had like two pieces of advice. She said, first of all, you're the best. You're awesome. All the things you're doing so far, it's not great. She said, second of all, don't call Jack. She said, second of all, you can do this on your own. This is a great test for you. You just keep going. You can do this by yourself. You don't need any help. Just keep going. And that kind of like, you can do it was exactly what I needed. And she was awesome, right? My early board, they were great and they were very helpful.
Do you regret? Do you regret not calling Jack? Because until you just said that, it didn't even occur to me that that would have been on the table. But do you regret not calling him, or are you look back and you go, no, I needed to make my mark there.
I caught him a lot particularly in the early years, but it's one of those things where um, it's an interesting thing about leaders and successors and advice. Like some people, my lead director for a lot of years was the ex-CEO of Johnson & Johnson named Ralph Larson. And Ralph was able to give advice saying, here's what I would do if I were you, right? Jack was incapable of that. Jack's advice was, here's what you should do. Here's what you should do, right? And I knew that about Jack. So if you were going to ask him for advice, he was going to give it to you in a way that was like context free. It was just do it my way, but not your way, right? He was never able to see life quite that way. Not a positive or negative. That was just not in his wheelhouse. It's just his style. So some people are able to give advice in a way that you can tee it up for somebody in their lifestyle, right? In their frame of view, in their moment, in their time. That wasn't the way he could do it.
Let's just talk about Jack for a second. You talk about your opinions of Jack in the book, and that's not actually where I wanted to go with the question. You replaced an iconic CEO who had been CEO for 20 years. He was voted CEO of the century. Regardless of how true that feels to you, having been inside the company after you took over. Those are big shoes. Those are really big shoes. And I know that you talk about in the book how difficult it was to walk in after a tenure like that and start making some changes. What did you would have heard the words, that's not how we do things around here, a lot, I'm assuming, during that period. What did you learn about driving what was potentially unpopular change?
Yeah, I think when you look, it's always easier to replace a bum. So first and foremost, it's much easier,
it's much easier to be the hero. It's always easier to be the hero.
For all your listeners. But I think that the key thing is you've got to make it about the environment and not about personalities. You've got to make it about, here's what's going on in the world. And because of these changes going on in the world, we've got to change. We've got to do things differently. We've got to do things better. We've got to do things faster. We've got to do this in this way. And it's not about Jeff versus Jack, or it's not about Jack at all. In fact, in many ways, he's irrelevant. This is about, China's growing, or digital's growing, or the environment is more of a concern, or things like that. So I think, Julie, you've got to be willing to peg everything has to be about the changes that are going on in the world. And if you want to stay relevant in the 21st century, and even if you do that, it's still hard, right? Even if you do that, it's still incredibly hard. I see a ton of legacy companies in Silicon Valley that are coming out trying to drive digital transformation, and they're still way behind, right? And they know the technology's coming. They know they need to change. They know how hard it is. But even with all that, getting the right people, getting the right culture, getting the right environment, getting the right business model is still incredibly difficult. Change is hard in big companies. Change is really hard.
And question that pops into my head then, do you start with consensus building? Do you start with trying to get everybody on the bus in the ways that they need to get on the bus? So individually, collectively, as teams, nations. Or do you start with, this is an on the bus or off the bus situation? I'm not going to try and, I'm not going to coax you.
I think it's a great question. I would say I tended to do it more, a little, I would say I lean 60-40 on fiat versus consensus. So, with 300,000 people, you need a little bit of consensus. But if you did totally consensus, you were screwed, right? So in 2010, we did a huge global initiative that was spectacularly successful and really changed the shape of the company. And it was mainly tops down, but had lots of momentum inside the company. And it was a little bit of fiat and a little bit of consensus, but a lot of fiat, right? But it worked. And then I tried to do it with digital, and it didn't work. It didn't work. And, and it just was just so friggin' hard, right? And I think to a certain extent, what happens in digital is so many things need to change, right? You need there's a technical change, there's
It's
an
also a
organ,
mindset change.
there's a mindset change, there's an organizational change, there's a cultural change, but it's so critical to survival and to so I think to a certain extent, what you have to do is actually reorganize the totality of the company. You can't have big pockets of resistance. You have to break the resistance into smaller. If I had to do it over again, I would have kind of decoupled I would have actually broken the company down into smaller pockets, so I didn't have big pockets of resistance. I would have really broken it down into smaller organizations so that no one organization could have stopped the momentum. But the question you ask is really it's actually quite a relevant question for every change initiative that goes on. And at the end of the day, I think after years of kind of getting bureaucracies out of the system, I see way too much bureaucracy, back into, again, I sit in the US. And look, our president's unpopular, politicians are unpopular. We have a baby formula issue in the US. Who would have thought? You'd sit here that maybe the most successful country in the world over time can't get enough baby formula on the shelves. And we blame the president of the United States. We don't blame the companies for not having enough baby formula, but it's the company's fault, right? So it's crazy. So go figure.
You talked about the separating out of the entities.
Yeah.
And I've heard that a number of times recently. I've heard it from CEOs, I've heard it from innovation experts, that the smartest way to approach innovation as a leader is often to break off pieces.
Yeah.
And to say, okay, I'm going to create the company that is going to beat my company. Your job is to go out there and compete with the mothership on all things tech, on all things digital, basically just reinvent how we do things as a separate entity, and we need to compete with you. And so then you've got both those pieces that you're running there, each keeping the other sharp, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a way that you would have gone with
I
it?
think that can work. I think that can work. I was taking kind of a different approach, Julie, which is, kind of when we were trying to drive the digital initiative, we had a bunch of, let's say, 10 or $20 billion revenue divisions. So they were big. I would have broken them back down into being $3 or $4 billion divisions. I would have, instead of having, let's say, 10 $10 billion divisions, I would have had $25 billion divisions. And in each one, I would have had their own digital frame, so that you had less bureaucracy, more generation of ideas, and fewer kind of antibodies. Antibodies grow in bigger bureaucracies, more ideas, more speed, more capability, being able to do that. So that's what I think. It's just size breeds bureaucracy. Bureaucracy breeds antibodies. It's too important to get this right, and you've got to be able to do it. So I'm kind of like in a boat now of like big organizations have to kind of get after this anti-bureaucracy mode yet again. However you need to take it on, you've got to take it on again. And again, I've seen this 20 years ago. I see it again today.
I think it was from your book. You said that, and as I remember, it was from one of the partners at BCG, this original quote, that complexity in the world at large has increased by 6% over the past few decades, but organizational complexity has increased by 35%.
Yeah, no, I think that's again. I
Incredible.
think I go back to we've now had like a complete generation of management theory, whereas it has been positive. And look, I'm a product of it, right? So it's like I'm not here because I'm like I have any right to be critical because I'm a product of it, but it's gone too far, right? So I'm into like first principles, anti-complexity, anti-bureaucracy, digital transformation, right? That's kind of what I would get everybody back into, right? If you're running an airline, on-time delivery, premium fare, those are that's what not capital allocation and blah blah. If you're in the aviation business, you're really not in the capital allocation. Like I don't think Tim Cook has ever talked about capital allocation. He's talking about great products, great service. That's what he talks about. So I just think I think we've had a whole generation of professional management, professional investing, private equity, blah blah blah. Okay, great, great. There's something new that's coming. It's going to come in big companies and small. I don't think this is a big company, small company, and really sitting in the valley. I don't think tech's gonna. I don't. It's too much of a bubble here, right? Like I don't sit here and say software is going to take over the world because people here like California too much. They're too lazy in some ways to take over Alabama or Virginia or something like that. So I still think there's going to be another wave, industrial wave out there yet to be had, but it's going to be in a different structure than where it is right now.
You said I'm going a lot to quotes here, but there was so many quotes from the book that really struck me. You said I made thousands of decisions impacting millions of people, often in the midst of blinding uncertainty and second guessed by countless critics. I wanted to speak to that because many leaders have been in a version of that over the past 2-3 years, and every leader has found themselves in some kind of a version of that. Large numbers, small numbers. What did you come to use as your decision-making compass during those times? Because when you don't have enough information, and when, again, we can't rely on luck or brilliance, and everybody has competing opinions, what did you come back to as your compass?
Yeah, I think I think that again, you've got a circle of people that you're listening to views from. So it's kind of like you pick you pick your own board of directors, right? You do the best you can on what I would call risk reward, right? So you get the best information and data you can on risk reward. I think a good leader always walks around with a point of view, right? My point of view was market share, markets rule, technology, but when in doubt, go with the market. And then you make a decision and live with the decision that you make, right? And learn from it, but make it. Be willing to make it.
Mm.
So
And having a clear North Star there that you just mentioned, when in doubt,
yeah,
go with the market.
I think it's like I think like I think sometimes people think their aspect or their North Star is we'll see. Okay, we'll see. You're not going to run anything if we'll see is your North Star, right? You've got to have some kind of point of view, right? You just have to walk around, and everybody knew that my point of view was like if we're in a crisis and we get a chance to come out of the crisis with higher market share, we were going to do that. We were going to do that. My CFO knew that. My salespeople knew that. My manufacturing people knew that, and we did that. We acted on that, right? Even if it meant taking a little bit more risk, even if it meant kind of, doing things that made some people uncomfortable every now and then, we would do that. So that was the point of view with which we ran the place. My CFO, Keith Sharon, I never made one decision that I didn't ask his opinion on or that I didn't listen to kind of what his perspective was. So there was always kind of a co-pilot that had this voice that was like, he was like the village priest. There was somebody that you would always, and I think it was just, I never panicked. Julie, it's like knowing what to do is kind of like easy, but knowing when to do it is always hard. So it's being deliberative about, kind of like, you know, if you're too late, it's bad. If you're too early, it's bad. But kind of that sense of, okay, we've got 24 hours to make this decision, or we've got a month to make this decision, or we've got a year to make this decision. In a crisis, you typically have 12 hours to make a decision, and knowing when those 12 hours are. So, those are the ways that you kind of make a decision. And you kind of, I would go entire weeks without reading newspapers sometimes. Because like when you know the truth, you don't need to read an interpretation of the truth. And I would go home, and I always try to keep a separation with my family and work, but I could tell that my wife had read like a really crappy article about me, and I'd go home and she just wanted to like, ugh. And I'd say, I don't want to, she'd want to like say, that asshole, this said this or that. I said, I don't want to hear it. Just don't tell me. Don't tell me what they said, or don't tell me what they wrote. I just don't want. I don't want to hear it. And it's just, you need this kind of sanguine. You need the ability, this peace of mind that sometimes if you're reading about it in real time, you can't keep your wits about you to kind of do the things you need to do. To be to make a clear decision.
That's part of what you were saying about originally at the beginning of this conversation, which was choosing who you listen to, making a clear and conscious choice as to the information sources that I'm going to allow in, so that I can stay, focused on track and move as quickly as I need to move.
Yeah. It's the last thing I'd say, Julie, is this notion of having conviction. This is another real trick of leadership, which is a good leader's got to have conviction, and you've got to like hear things at the same time. In other words, you got to be able to be like, particularly when you run a big company of hundreds of thousands of people, if they see weakness at all, you lose 50,000 people right away. Okay. So you've got to walk into a room and say, we are going to do China, right? We're going to do digital. And if you walk in the room and say, we're going to do digital, I think you've lost 50,000 people. So you've got to say, we're going to do digital, but you have to like have a little bit of sensory perception with the 15 people that say, but here's how you can do it better. You can do it. And so you've got to be able to have a maximum amount of conviction while still allowing a few new ideas or self-correction in the side door. And that's a real trick. That is really hard to do. I'm not sure I always did it well. I always try to do it well, but it's hard to do, especially in big distributed organizations.
And there's a truth to the fact that your energy, your certainty is what fuels momentum as a leader. Pace of the leader, pace of the pack. We've all heard that one.
1,000%.
And when in order to hold that space and stay that certain and keep that momentum going, you need to be very careful about the voices that you let in, but you still need to let some voices in, and not just the ones that agree with you.
100%. That's another good book. And it's really like, again, like, what makes Elon Musk great? What makes Elon Musk great? He's so, so think about when he did Tesla, like every electric vehicle was a piece of crap. And he was the only person that really saw that it could be a great car. It could be a luxury car. Amazing what he did. And it could be a power generating units, things like that. Personally, I think he's great, by the way. I think he's amazing and good for everything. Look, personally, I wish he wouldn't do Twitter, and I bet he's got 80% of the people that work at Tesla is probably secretly saying, don't do Twitter, but,
Somebody remove his phone, remove the app
he's
from his
Elon
phone.
Musk, he's Elon Musk, right? So does he keep going forward? Does he listen? What does he do? So it's just this incredible point of leadership, which is you really need to have conviction to get anything important done. Leaders who say we'll see fail. I've seen them fail time after time after time. And leaders that can't make a decision fail time after time after time. But if you don't allow a few voices in, you also fail, right? So this notion of acting and listening is kind of a trick.
I'm gonna one of my last questions. You said leadership, which I think we've covered in many different ways today, is an intense journey into yourself. Probably more so when it goes wrong than when it goes right. When it goes right, it's not so much of a journey into yourself. It's more of a receiving of applause. But when it goes wrong, it definitely is. What's the number for any leaders out there, any CEOs out there right now who have gone through a massive period of uncertainty, who have gone through periods of time where there is no handbook, as you did? What's the number one lesson that you would say that you took from that journey with GE?
I'd say a couple of things. Like, one is, in some way, shape, or form. So I'm 66 years old now. In some way, shape, or form, I probably thought about leadership every day for the last 40 years. Every day. What am I learning? What am I doing? How can I reflect every day? So it's such an evergreen kind of learning process. And I think if you want to be good at it, you just got to be willing to inspect it and think about it and dwell on it and stuff like that. And then I would say to your listeners, I'd say, like, sometimes even when you try and your intentions are good and you work your ass off and you've done everything you know how to do, it just doesn't work the way you want it to, right? Sometimes you can give it 1,000% effort and do it with love, and it just doesn't work. It doesn't work the way you want it to. And then you hit a fork in the road, and you can either, suck your thumb, or you get off your ass and keep going.
Keep showing up.
Keep showing up.
Keep showing up, however big or small. Thank you so much for your time, Jeff, today. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Same here. Hopefully we meet in person someday.
Thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode and have seized hold of at least one tool, idea, or mindset that will help you start raising your own level of influence. Now, for those of you who want to take the next step in your journey or would just love a roadmap to becoming the most influential voice, idea, or brand in your space, then I have good news. You can now download the latest updated version of my ebook, The Influencer Code, from my website, juliemasters.com. Also, there's a link in the show notes. Just pop in your email address, and I promise I will not spam you, but it is jam-packed full of ideas, tools, and case studies that I have come across in my now 20 plus years of doing this work. Not to mention the 7 areas and 7 core questions that I have found to be hands down the most valuable when it comes to immediately lifting your ability to make an impact. Download it, keep it, share it, juice it for all it is worth. I hope it makes a massive difference in both your career and your business. Thank you always to my co-founder and the main brain behind this podcast, Lauren Kelly. You kick my butt in all the right ways. Thank you for making it happen. And if you did enjoy the show, then we would love you to share this podcast and leave us a review on iTunes, Google, Stitcher, whatever your platform of choice happens to be. And don't forget to subscribe to make sure that you never miss an episode.